Say we knew how to rewind the effects of postmodernism on the younger generation, what will we have wound back to? Would everything be better if postmodernism were indeed destroyed and we returned to the days before Nietzsche exposed the sham proofs of the philosophers? It is exactly the futile attempt to provide a scientific replacement for God that created postmodernism in the first place. All right, so let's turn to the second half of the discussion. What sort of talk do we propose to offer to the postmodernist? How are we to respond to it in a way that makes any difference for all those who are lacking divine guidance? And Nietzsche has made exactly this point. God is out. For those lacking divine guidance, what is there in life but human beings acting in the service of whatever moves them? Is the postmodern position not a reasonable conclusion if you have no God? Does it make sense to you to suggest that people today, thinking in this postmodern way, without God, in the manner I described in the first half, does it make sense to suggest that these people should believe in truth, reason, and objective morality? In other words, should the postmodernist just be modern? Does it really make sense now that modernity has been declared by postmodernists a failed project for Christians to argue that postmodernists should be open to proofs that there is truth? But that is simply to ask them to be modernists again. Say we knew how to rewind the effects of postmodernism on the younger generation, what will we have wound back to? Ask yourself this: would everything be better if postmodernism were indeed destroyed? That is, if the people who thought this way vanished, and we returned to the days before Nietzsche exposed the sham proofs of the philosophers? It is exactly the futile attempt to provide a scientific replacement for God, grounding belief in rational proofs, that created postmodernism in the first place. In this second half, I want to try to answer the question, does it make sense to ask the godless to accept reality or the truth as their master and tailor their lives accordingly? And by the truth, I don't mean the greatest truth we know, which has taken root in us by grace, but the kind of truth that we say is accessible to everyone by reason, by science, self-evidently. And to focus this discussion, let's pick one such truth that we are talking about today, the gender binary, the fact that we are male or female, period. This is not called a religious question. It is called a scientific question. Take last month's issue of the National Review, where it is considered an issue of biological reality, the simple truth. That distinction, by the way, between a religious question and a scientific question might remind you of that point in our history that was the start of the modern period, when that very distinction between a religious question and a scientific question was made. To answer certain kinds of question, does the mind give us access to reality? How many sexes are there? We look at the evidence, the facts. We do not ask God. So the question I wish to ask is this, and since among the godless I include people who think in a postmodern way, to answer this, we have to have a strong sense of how such a person thinks. I have tried to convey this, but my suspicion is that one sweep of the brush won't quite cover it. And so I want to remind you of the outlook. In fact, I would like you to try to see postmodernism from the inside, from the perspective of a person different than you are, by looking at the ideas of Richard Rorty. And I choose Rorty just because he did not call himself a postmodernist. He said, I don't find postmodernism a very useful notion, but part of what people call postmodernism is the tradition of French and German philosophy that goes back to roughly Nietzsche, and that's just the European equivalent of the pragmatic strain in American philosophy that goes back to James and Dewey. James and Nietzsche were roughly contemporaries and inspired the same movements. Nietzsche thought of the Enlightenment's revolt against religion as substituting for God a sort of surrogate called reason. Nietzsche thought that the idea was not to have either God or a surrogate for God, but just to think of human beings as on their own, making themselves up as they go along. And Dewey had roughly the same views. Now, these figures he mentions, Nietzsche, James, and Dewey, Rorty's heroes, are never called postmodernists. But Rorty also says this: if one teaches philosophy as I do, one is expected to tell the young that their society, modern democracy, Western civilization, is not just one of the better ones so far contrived, but one which embodies truth and reason. But my own philosophical views I share with Nietzsche and Dewey, forbid me to say this kind of thing. I do not have much use for notions like objective value and objective truth. I think that the so-called postmodernists are right in most of their criticisms of traditional philosophical talk about reason. As I'm suggesting, what we call postmodernism is in fact something much broader than postmodernism. There is something shared by Nietzsche, James, Dewey, Rorty, Sartre, Foucault, Derrida, that we should get used to thinking of as postmodernism. Why does Rorty say, I don't find postmodernism a very useful notion? Only because he sees the grandparents of Western culture, so to speak, as the same kind of people as the parents, believers in truth, reason, etc. But Rorty is not the person to instruct us about Christian thought. Rorty was an atheist. The feature that separates these generations, recall, belief as trust in God, attention to strong and weak, is not going to amount to anything in Rorty's eyes. For Rorty, today's thinking is not a reaction to specifically modern thought. He sees it as a rejection of something in all thought going back to Plato, belief in access to reality. But we don't have time to look at the distinct difference between trust in the existence of a reality to represent and trust in a God who is your Father. Before we return to our question, just a page or so from a powerful autobiographical essay that Rorty wrote called Trotsky and the Wild Orchids. He writes, I'm sometimes told that my views are so weird as to be merely frivolous. My critics suspect that I will say anything to get a gasp, but I'm just amusing myself by contradicting everybody else. This hurts. So I have tried in what follows to say something about how I got into my present position. Perhaps this bit of autobiography will make clear that my views were not adopted for frivolous reasons. Rorty's grandfather was Walter Rauschenbusch, a seventh-generation minister who saw Jesus as someone dedicated to social reform. Christianity and the Social Crisis, 1907, was a seminal statement of the social gospel movement. Rorty's parents were socialists, and he writes, I grew up knowing that all decent people were socialists, concerned with the plight of the poor, the exploited. At 15, he went to the Great Books program at the University of Chicago, taught by Robert Hutchins and Mortimer Adler, who, he said, had enveloped much of the University of Chicago in a neo-Aristotelian mystique. Aristotle is a philosopher who talks a great deal about human nature and reason as giving us access to reality. Rorty says, the most frequent target of his professor's sneers was John Dewey's pragmatism, which, according to Hutchins and Adler, was vulgar, relativistic, and self-refuting. As they pointed out over and over again, Dewey had no absolutes. To say, as Dewey did, that growth itself is the only moral end, left one without a criterion for growth, and thus with no way to refute Hitler's suggestion that Germany had grown under his rule. To say that truth is what works, here Rorty is giving a nutshell definition of pragmatism's view of truth. Say that truth is what works is to reduce the quest for truth to the quest for power. Only an appeal to something eternal, absolute, and good, like the God of St. Thomas, or the nature of human beings described by Aristotle, would permit one to answer the Nazis. So this is Hutchins and Adler's argument against being without absolutes. You cannot refute Nazism. It has to be refuted. All of them seem to agree that something deeper and weightier than Dewey was needed if one was to explain why it would be better to be dead than to be a Nazi. This sounded pretty good to my 15-year-old ears. I decided to major in philosophy. I figured that if I became a philosopher, I might ascend to Plato's heaven, where the full sunshine of truth irradiates the purified soul of the wise and good. It seemed obvious to me that getting to such a place was what everybody with any brains really wanted. For all these reasons, I wanted very much to be some kind of Platonist. And from 15 to 20, I did my best. But it didn't pan out. I was also worrying about another problem, which I will summarize as follows. On any important issue, Rorty's words, our disagreements seem to involve unshakable and contrary convictions about basic things. Rorty writes, the more philosophers I read, the clearer it seemed that each of them could carry their views back to first principles, which were incompatible with the first principles of their opponents, and that none of them ever got to that fabled Platonic heaven of undeniable truths. There seemed to be nothing like a neutral standpoint from which these alternative first principles could be evaluated. But if there were no such standpoint, then the whole idea of rational certainty and the whole Socratic Platonic idea of replacing passion by reason seemed not to make much sense. You see what Rorty is saying? When you turn back to fundamental principles, defined as what everyone must and therefore will accept, what is undeniable, these do not simply add up to dictate a common outlook. We are governed not simply by facts or principles, but also by deep-seated commitments. The outlook we call ours is not delivered to us at this level. It is self-evident things plus things we are committed to. First projects, then principles. Eventually, he writes, I decided that it was all right to stop trying for eternity and just be the child of the present time. This was the appropriate response to Plato. And in time, I found myself being led back to Dewey. Rorty also mentions the influence of Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault, two key figures of postmodernism proper. The result of this small epiphany was a book called Philosophy and the Mirror of Nature, in which I articulated my historicist anti-Platonism. This is perhaps Rorty's most famous book, which is about dropping the old idea that philosophy is a mirror of nature or reality that captures things in mirror-like fashion, just as they are. As time passed, Rorty came to think that, as he notes, there's nothing sacred about universality which makes the shared automatically better than the unshared. This means that the fact that you have obligations to other people, not to bully them, to join them in overthrowing tyrants, to feed them when they're hungry, does not entail that what you share with other people is more important than anything else. What you share with them when you are aware of such moral obligations is not rationality or human nature or the fatherhood of God or a knowledge of the moral law or anything other than ability to sympathize with the pain of others. Dewey thought, as I now do, that there was nothing bigger, more permanent, and more reliable behind our sense of moral obligation to those in pain than a certain contingent historical phenomenon. The gradual spread of the sense that the pain of others matters, regardless of whether they're in the same family, tribe, color, religion, nation, or intelligence as oneself. This idea, Dewey thought, cannot be shown to be true by science or religion or philosophy. At least if shown to be true means capable of being made evident to everyone regardless of background. It can only be made evident to people whom it is not too late to acculturate into our own particular late-blooming, historically contingent form of life. And now to our closing topic as a kind of test of any conclusion you may have reached as to how we should speak to postmodernists to have an impact, change their thinking and their influence on this culture. Given what you now understand of the postmodern position, consider the gender binary and ask this simple question. Who is right about how many sexes there are? Presumably you would say the realist, the believer in objective reality. Now, make the argument that proves this, that there are two sexes. 8 years ago, in a talk I gave on postmodernism, I showed this picture, which I had found somewhere with the caption, "Post-op transgender." Once upon a time, there was an age in which some people honored a human nature seen as part of a divine order. But now what we are given is just a starting place. We can alter nature. And 8 years after I showed this picture to make this point, the culture has said so loud and clear. The general culture now agrees with philosopher Judith Butler, who says, gender is not something that one is. It is something one does, an act, a doing rather than a being. The parts you are born with are just organs to which a meaning has to be attached. The point I made then was that what is given demands a response from you, acceptance or rejection. Is that true? Your body is given to you, but we might now say that to a human being, this invites a response, acceptance or rejection. Why accept nature? Here's one view. Reality must be accepted. Resisting reality will destroy you. A person may say that nature is not their master, but it is their master, where the issue is, as we noted, fire. The potential of nature must be accepted. Ignore it at your peril. Do such and such, and you might burn to death. Or sex reassignment, do such and such, and you will destroy your capacity to reproduce, or you will isolate yourself socially. With regard to the potential of nature, reality is your master. Resist, and there will be consequences. But human beings will then say, this rule that reality must be accepted just boils down to the consequences of our actions must be accepted. We act in reality, but we don't ask reality what we should do. We don't take direction from reality. Enter a burning building and you might burn to death. But I have to decide what to do here. Perhaps someone's children are in that house. And facts about the natural order don't dictate my answer. Sometimes we have reason to destroy our capacity to reproduce. I have to decide. Nature is not my master. Move now to the issue of accepting your body because that is the body you were given. Is that a good reason to the postmodernist? You were given a nature. Rorty said that in the Great Books program he was in as a student. This program was big on Aristotle, who said that we have a nature. We are male and female, defined as follows. I quote Thomas Aquinas based on Aristotle. Male is that which can generate in another, and female is that which can generate in oneself. A person, this is just fact, is born in one state or the other. You cannot even ask, but why remain in that state? Whatever you choose to do, that will be your state. If you were born female, say, surgery is not going to give you the power to generate in another. So the potential you have is indeed given. This potential of nature is the reality we said you do have to accept. You have no choice in the matter. But now there is Butler's point. You still have to decide whether to live according to that potential. Why be a male in the sense of presenting as one, playing the male role in society, etc.? Why keep the organs that give you that potential? Or say you do keep them. Why not get breasts and live as you decide? It was in just this sense that we said nature is not a person's master. We may choose to override it and live with the unavoidable consequences. Again, we have an undeniable fact about potential that must be accepted, but the question now is why we should submit to it, take direction from it, if, as in this person's case, it means suppressing your desires. Why submit to reality just because it is? Rorty thought that the Enlightenment had rejected religion and replaced God with, quote, a surrogate called reason, or the absolute truth attainable by reason. People have already stopped submitting to God. Why would they now submit to nature, biology? Similar to the case we just saw, this is a woman who chose to live, in some sense, as a man. Took hormones, but also wanted to have a child. Why not have both, if both is possible, as it obviously is? When nature gives you a certain body, for you to accept it, when you have a desire to change your body, you have to have a good reason. And our question is because it is given to you a good reason? Why accept reality in that sense? And is that our offer to the postmodernist? Is that the meaning we hold out? A human being needs the meaning, except to be a man because that's what is. Why does what is count in their eyes? Why does it count in ours? Isn't the real argument always about the meaning? Why not choose what is meaningful over what is factual? And one of the ruling ideas in postmodern thought turns out to be, let me do what I want to do. A request that is commonly mocked as childish. But it is not really childish when it relates to the dynamic that I just described. You say this is the most meaningful thing, not dying by fire, but it isn't to me. So stop telling me what you think I should do. Let me do what I want to do, what has meaning to me. In the case of a person born male by Aristotle's definition, but who wishes to present as female or live with some mix of features, why stay as you are just because you were born that way? We might say, accept your nature because it is the truth about you. But what is the status of this truth that we are recommending to the postmodernist? That is, what does the postmodernist believe the truth has been over the centuries? It has been bluster, rhetoric. Are we asking the postmodernist to ignore what he or she believes has been learned about moral philosophy? What if we say, accept your nature because it is the truth about you, not mentioning God, because we know that will not sway this atheist, but thinking ourselves, God is their master. God is saying, don't damage yourself. Don't distort yourself. This is, I suggest, exactly that brand of distinctly modern faithlessness, cousin to the thinking. If a person gets the right answer, makes the right choice in the end, paying no attention to God in the process, then all is well. Because the right choice, the right action, is the essential thing. Well, I suggest that it is not true that the right choice, the right action, is the essential thing. The essential thing is God. It is hearing God say, in the way God would say it, don't be damaged. And then choosing accordingly in your relationship with God. To think about God ourselves, but keep God out of the discussion, is the familiar modern embarrassment about God. Why not give our own answer? We have returned then to the question, what is our offer to the postmodern thinker? It must involve dropping these modern reflexes. We have to get away from postmodernism, away from modern thinking, and get back to our own thinking. And are we doing this when we argue, science says you are a man? What are you offering to the person like Rorty, who says that the world, as it is described by the physical sciences, teaches no moral lesson, offers no spiritual comfort? What does the claim that science says you are a man offer to the Sartrean or Nietzschean, who says that if you accept from science this verdict as to what you are, then it is you who has made science your master? And so it is not your master. You might elect a more meaningful master, if you know one. And so it is not really science that is the master at all. Much as a Christian will say, my fallen nature demands that I sin, but I choose another master, as per Jesus' talk about the two masters. Consider now the issue of simply being in error about this question. Is it self-evident that there are two sexes? We all know about sexual dimorphism, which means that there are two forms, one for each of the two agents required to reproduce. Reproduction is a defining element of living creatures, which have been understood for eons as creatures that reproduce. And in a vast portion of the animal kingdom, reproduction takes two partners providing different things. We call them male and female, thus two sexes. Hermaphrodites have parts of both and are not evidence of a third sex. This is a condition, the result of a disturbance in development. And I'm told that you can tell, but you people should know, please correct me on this, which sex a hermaphrodite is, say, by which parts have reproductive power. Nature dictates that for reproduction, you need two sexes, male and female. So we have just said that the answer to the question, how many sexes are there, is given by looking at reproductivity. But here's a question. What about this question? Does nature dictate that we turn to reproductivity to answer the question, how many sexes are there? We might say, but that is what the concept of sex refers to. This is the meaning of the term. Sex organs are organs of reproduction. The features we should look at to answer the question, how many sexes are there, are the features involved in reproduction. Ovaries, testes, X and Y chromosomes, hormones. But the question remains, do we have to answer the question, how many sexes are there, in that way? Is that dictated by reality? Take all these given features of a human being. Again, no one is denying that the potential of nature must be accepted. Reproduction takes two, male and female, the one that can generate in another and the one that can generate in itself. No postmodernist resists reality on the potential of nature. The postmodern couple asks their doctor for fertility help. But what does reality say about how many sexes there are? That is, isn't it up to people to ask, should these two roles related to reproduction be the whole range of options for human sexual identity? Ways in which to live. Postmodernists do not deny the facts of reproduction. They accept science. They know what hormones and so on people need to conceive when that is an issue. But in culture, sex is a broader issue. Things you find online. It is not reducible to reproduction. When the question is asked, what does reality say about whether human sex roles should be reduced to two, limited by the issue of reproduction? What, in reality, stops us from going beyond sexual dimorphism, organs of reproduction, ovaries, etc., and looking at more features, not focusing on reproduction, to answer the question, how many sexes are there? You might reply, the facts of reproduction don't resolve this. And you might add, and this is where the real money is, actually, away from facts of biology. Here, in the discussion of sex, let's indeed talk about sex in this wider sense. What do you want from it? What's it all about? But back to that question, is there anything in nature that requires us to say the term sex can be limited only to reproduction? Or the determination of a person's sex must be restricted to physical structures and biological processes related to reproduction? What you make of the term sex, which is indeed used in society to classify people, what bathroom you use has nothing directly to do with reproduction. What you make of the term sex is not dictated to you by nature. It is not a datum of that kind. We have been happy most everywhere in the world, up till now, or so it seems, to take reproductivity as the basis of a distinction, which is binary, that we also use in this social way to designate bathrooms, to define marriage, to differentiate clothing, and all kinds of things, probably. But have we done that because nature has given us no other choice? Or have we done that because that is the kind of people we are? We are people who see ourselves in this way, who accept to be so defined around reproduction, in the process of, to quote Sartre, realizing a type of humanity. A people faithful to a verse in Genesis, for instance. If so, then it is a cultural or a historical thing. To say that does not deny God's existence. God does what is said here, and we become, culturally and historically, his people. Look at this claim from the website of an organization whose, quote, mission is to create a gender-inclusive world for all children and youth. You see the child here. These groups have sprung up to serve the school system. Most societies view sex as a binary concept with two rigidly fixed options, male or female, both based on a person's reproductive functions, genitals, sex chromosomes, gonads, hormones, reproductive structures. But a sex binary fails to capture even the biological aspect of gender. Well, this last remark is not clear to me, but they are clearly saying that sex is a concept that is not simply biological and not reducible to reproductive functions. And back to my question, is what they are saying contradicted by the facts? Is it an undeniable fact of nature that sex is a concept that must be defined by physical features involving reproduction? I think we have to say no. Sex in this wider sense, not necessarily. Our culture accepted that binary distinction. But if you look at our culture blind to the presence of God, as Nietzsche and Rorty were, all you see is the action of a culture. There's nothing in facts of nature that compels people who are their own masters to accept the division we see made here in Genesis. How many sexes there are is settled here in this verse for us. And we, our generation, were always able to understand how this division into two was made. It is linked with the facts of reproduction and the emphasis in Genesis on multiplying. But this understanding of sex, which we have maintained as a central part of our culture, is quite deniable. It is not a given of nature, and it has come to be denied in a culture that is not ours. Ask yourself, what has stopped Christians from following postmodernists? Actually, we see Christians doing just that today. But I, for example, accept the text of Scripture as the voice of my master. I said earlier that to answer certain kinds of questions, how many sexes are there? Some people, this is the modern approach, look at the facts. We do not ask God. But I am one of those people who does ask God. The text of Genesis is sufficient for me, but it isn't for other Christians. And still other Christians dislike my approach because I have no argument with a hold on unbelievers. And so I don't. But if you ask me, fidelity to the Father in this heavenly earthly family is the only force that can resist the winds. Put gender on any other footing, and it will be swept away. We're seeing it happen. Two sexes, gone. That passage continues, while most bodies have one of two forms of genitalia, which are classified as female or male, there are naturally occurring intersex conditions that demonstrate that sex exists across a continuum of possibilities. This biological spectrum by itself should be enough to dispel the simplistic notion of the gender binary. There are not just two sexes. Well, if you don't focus on reproduction, is the hermaphrodite a disruption of the development of reproduction? Reproductive potential, Why is the hermaphrodite not an amazing and unique mixture? And where now would you turn to count the various sexes? There is no counting. And this is what those speaking for science, or proposing to do so, are saying today. My culture says that there are two sexes, and scientists in my culture have always agreed. But the new culture of postmodernism is giving us the new science of sex and gender. This is Scientific American, which I always took to be serious science. It was always way over my head. To varying extents, let me quote from this issue, many of us are biological hybrids on a male-female continuum. These findings have far-reaching implications beyond just updating the biology textbooks. They have particular bearing on issues of personal identity, health, and the economic well-being of women. And notice that mix of categories there. Moving from biological features into issues of identity, health, economic well-being. In the same, updating the textbooks. The kind of structures and processes studied by science gave us this. These are from different biological texts, 1967 European textbook. Two forms explained by reproduction, right? This is what you get when you study structures and processes. National Geographic, shift to National Geographic, is giving us this, 15 divisions. But this is not biology. We are in a zone of some kind of perceived friction between a biological classification and cultural identity. But back to Scientific American. In the same issue, we have this chart titled The Extraordinary Complexity of Sex Determination. If you do not tie sex differentiation to reproduction, then a spectrum of variations is just what you have. Thus, the authors write about, quote, the intricate choreography of genetic and chemical factors that unfolds over time. Well, my culture finishes that sentence by saying, unfolds over time into male or female. But this culture, as we saw throughout the sexual revolution of the 20th century, does not think of sex in connection with reproduction. And surely that is a relevant issue at the heart of this trouble. So I would ask you, if you define sex around reproduction, is it because facts require you to do this? Or is it because you choose this because of a deep-seated commitment, because you are a Christian, because of who you are in this other existential sense? Have we accepted that there are two sexes on the basis of nature? Or were we told that there are two sexes by our Father in Genesis, and have then understood that number by its relation to reproduction, and then ordered our lives as sexual beings in that binary way, in faithfulness? If so, why ask postmodernists to do what we never did? To do right without the help of God? If so, why not ask the postmodernist to join us? Obviously not over the facts of science. Finally then, postmodernism challenges us to mark the difference between two traditions on this and other issues, traditional and modern. The difference lies in the non-equivalence of truth, reality, and reason as they appear to a modern mind, and truth, reality, and reason in the Christian tradition. Consider reality. We asked, does it make sense to ask the godless person to accept reality as their master and tailor their lives accordingly? The answer is not if reality is understood in the modern fashion, as that which is revealed by natural human reason or science. That is not reality as Augustine sees it. Knowledge of reality is not what reasoning delivers. It is only what he calls right reason, the mind that is liberated from our fallenness, pressing down on it, the corruptible body, the commitments of rebellious people, pressing down on the mind so that we don't see reality. You do not get this weight off you by turning to science. What about truth? I mentioned this article from the National Review by David French. We haven't the time to go through it, but it argues against accepting gender pluralism by standing up for the truth. Its major claims are there are two sexes, male and female, as determined by nature. That there are two sexes is demonstrable fact, so the issue is simply true or false. Denying the truth has damaging consequences. I suppose you'll have to trust me that this is the argument, but let me flip through some of it just in passing. Claim 1, two sexes established by biological reality. I think I understand French's use of the word reality. It jives with the best definition of reality that I know from science fiction writer Philip K. Dick. Reality is that which, when you stop believing in it, doesn't go away. So biological reality is the undeniable fact that reproduction requires male and female. These things we can't deny. Then the claim about demonstrable fact, true and false. And finally, the consequence of denying the facts. The dangerous notion that people should amputate healthy organs in the quest to sculpt their bodies to become something they're not. I'll read just this from another article making that same last point. The beginning of the end for gender pluralism will come when some poor young man, upon reaching the age of majority, decides to sue the deep-pocketed psychologists in university hospitals that tried to remake him as a female when he was a child, according to their enlightened theories about his behavior, destroying the function of his sexual organs, depriving him forever of the chance at fatherhood, and condemning him to a life of yet more surgeries. He will show that in this matter, and only in this matter, did it become accepted to recommend treatments that increase the likelihood of suicide. Do you think the settlement figure will be somewhere in the 9 figures? But notice something about this argument against settling for gender plurality, though it refers repeatedly to demonstrable facts that show that there are two sexes, making this an issue of true versus false. It doesn't present these facts. If the biological evidence as to how many sexes there are is so decisive, why not present it? But the clinching facts are never stated. Yet if they were given to the postmodernist, would they overturn any of the postmodern positions I have presented? I suspect that if given, this evidence would prove easily resistible to the postmodernist, and for good reason, because the postmodernist would see that he is being offered the old story, a so-called truth that involves an unargued commitment to a gender binary based voluntarily on reproduction. Right? The embrace, the acceptance of something that is presented as something that you have no choice but to accept. The undeniable facts of reproduction do not dictate culture. These facts compel you to live as man or woman only if you have some reason for doing so, as French does, though he is arguing as if this is not a matter of accepting meaning, but a simple matter of registering self-evident facts. In other words, this is the old modernist bait and switch, the thing that brought postmodernism into existence in the first place. The strongest point actually made in these articles concerns the consequences. But again, isn't the issue respecting the potential and making your choice? Might the postmodernist just argue, but I accept the consequences? The case of minors is obviously a special issue. But if that is the issue, the scope of the argument is narrowing. The truth stated in this argument is notably weak in its impact. But could this be because truth is restricted to available experience, expressly avoiding reference to God? I don't have sufficient time actually to move from these small returns we are seeing on this issue and get something of impact. I can't, in the time I have left, having stretched your patience this far, just say a few things that will leave you with the sense, oh, this is how to speak to the postmodernist. This is how to stop the increasing rejection of all inheritances. I hope you appreciate how difficult this problem is. I will have to end with general suggestions. The very general suggestion that against these gale force winds rearranging the landscape, there is only one strength offered to us, and we will not engage it by avoiding, in modern fashion, all reference to God. Truth in the Christian tradition is deeper than the concept of undeniable experience. It is what opening the door leads to, what trust makes possible. Reality, excluding the reality of the preeminence of God, is impoverished reality. The Christian conception of reality is full. Reason in the Christian tradition is not the appeal to available and undeniable experience. That is a part of reason, essential in its place. Reason is a fuller power that gains strength in seeing the truth, which is its purpose, only as the pressure of the corruptible body, Augustine citing Paul, is lifted, and Christians understand how that comes about. Mustn't we advocate reason as Christians understand it, above all, as a window to God? The kind of argument the culture needs, even over an issue like gender, will have to involve offering something the postmodern person will be able to receive. This will have to begin in meaningful conversation, us having some awareness of how a postmodernist sees. He may see all wrong, but he is a human being and really ought to be given something. There's no doubt that the effective argument will involve the presentation of an undeniable fact. But by this we mean an undeniable fact that is in fact undeniable, even to the postmodernist. Surely we're getting the suggestion that it will also involve, and have to involve, a claim about the presence and relevance of God to the solution of this issue. Say the conversation in which this takes place moves toward clearing a space for Christ. Is this, on the right, a more powerful argument than the one on the left? Christians today are suffering a kind of schizophrenia, double-mindedness. They want this Christian argument in its place, the argument on the right, but mostly they don't want it because they say it is too weak. Turn your argument to God and people are going to walk away from it just as they walked away from the other. But the difference is that they have to walk away from the other argument. The argument on the left seeks to compel by reference to a biological reality that has no hold on the postmodernist. It actually compels postmodernists to be indifferent to what you are saying. This argument on the right does not have that character. It does not seek broad submission to the truth. It invites acceptance through the involvement of Christ. About this second argument, you might say, that won't solve the problem. That won't change things. What is the problem? Is change our issue? Hittinger mentioned mastery over nature as a modern theme, the power to command results. The challenge of postmodernism is to figure out how we think, fix this schizophrenia, so that we have something to offer, so that we use reason in the manner of a cathedral, putting forth something that speaks of the reality of Christ. Forgive me for going on at such length, but I found it difficult to find a way of clarifying the outlook of this moment in history, how people, our brothers and sisters, think, and bringing this together with a practical issue to let the rubber of all this talk hit the road, so to speak.